Halloween is supposed to be a night where fear is just a game, but for the survivors of these three true stories, the terror was absolute and the danger was fatally real. Why does the line between a prank and a predator blur so easily when everyone is wearing a mask? From a silent watcher in the suburbs to a cornfield that holds dark secrets, we are about to walk into the abyss. You might think you are safe inside your locked home, but after hearing this, you will never look at a trick-or-treater the same way again. The first story takes us back to October 31st, 2014, in a quiet subdivision of suburban Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights hummed with a sickly orange glow and the houses were spaced just far enough apart that a scream might not be heard over the sound of the wind, rattling the dry autumn leaves. Sarah, a 22-year-old college student, had decided to stay home while her parents attended a party across town. She had spent the early evening handing out miniature chocolate bars to ghosts and goblins, but by 9:30 at night, the doorbell had stopped ringing. The street was empty, reclaimed by the silence of the night. Sarah turned off the porch light, a universal signal that the candy was gone, and settled onto the living room couch to watch a classic slasher movie. It was a cliché, she knew, but it felt appropriate for the occasion. However, the atmosphere in the house shifted around 10:15. The wind had picked up outside, scratching branches against the siding like skeletal fingers trying to pry the vinyl loose. Sarah paused the movie to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she stood by the sink, looking out the window that faced the front yard, her heart skipped a beat. Standing directly under the street lamp across the road was a figure. It was motionless. In the daylight, a person in a costume is nothing to fear, but at night, standing perfectly still while the wind whipped their loose clothing around them, it triggered a primal alarm in Sarah's brain. The figure was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit, stained and dark, and a mask that looked like a distorted, pale face with hollowed-out black eyes. It wasn't the costume that terrified her. It was the stillness. He wasn't walking. He wasn't checking his phone. He was just staring directly at her house. Sarah tried to rationalize it. It was Halloween, after all. It was probably just a teenager trying to spook the neighbors or waiting for friends. She forced herself to look away, drank her water, and went back to the living room. She pressed play on the movie, but her eyes kept darting toward the front window. 10 minutes passed. Curiosity, or perhaps anxiety, got the better of her. She crawled on her hands and knees to the window, staying below the sill so she wouldn't be seen, and peeked over the edge. The figure had moved. He was no longer across the street. He was now standing at the edge of her driveway, 20 feet closer. He hadn't made a sound. His head was tilted slightly to the left, like a confused dog, but those black voids of eyes were fixed on the very window Sarah was peeking through. A cold dread washed over her, starting at the base of her spine and freezing her lungs. How did he know she was there? The lights inside were off, save for the flickering glow of the television. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she checked the signal. It was weak, but it was there. She didn't call the police yet. She didn't want to be the girl who cried wolf over a prankster. Instead, she texted her boyfriend, Mike, who lived 10 minutes away. "There is a weird guy staring at the house. I am freaking out," she wrote. As she hit send, a loud thud echoed from the front porch. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a heavy boot hitting the wood. Sarah froze. The figure had moved again, covering 20 feet in seconds without her seeing him move. She held her breath, listening to the silence of the house, waiting for a knock, a doorbell, or a voice. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the terrifying realization that there was only 2 inches of wood separating her from the man in the mask. She crept to the peephole, closing one eye and pressing the other against the glass. What she saw made her blood run cold. The porch was empty. He wasn't there. But where could he have gone so quickly? Panic began to set in. She backed away from the door, her eyes scanning the living room, the back door. The realization hit her like a physical blow. If he wasn't at the front door, he was circling the house. She sprinted to the kitchen, her socks sliding on the hardwood floor, and lunged for the back door lock. Her hand gripped the deadbolt just as the handle began to slowly, agonizingly turn from the outside. He was there. He was trying to get in. She slammed the deadbolt home with a loud click, and the handle stopped moving instantly. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. She backed into the center of the kitchen, clutching a steak knife she had grabbed from the counter, her breathing ragged and shallow. Then her phone buzzed. It wasn't Mike. It was a text from an unknown number. She looked down at the screen, and the message consisted of 3 words that shattered her reality. I see you. Before we find out if Sarah survives the night, if you want to ensure you don't miss the terrifying conclusion, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. And I have to ask you, what is the one sound you never want to hear when you are home alone at night? Let me know in the comments below. Sarah stared at the glowing screen of her phone, the 3 words burning into her retinas. I see you. The letters seemed to pulsate with malice in the dark kitchen. She dropped to the floor immediately, scrambling under the heavy oak dining table, clutching the steak knife so hard her knuckles turned white. The kitchen had a large sliding glass door, essentially a wall of windows. And even with the vertical blinds drawn, there were gaps. If he could see her, he was close. He was watching her right now. She dialed 911, her thumb hovering over the call button, shaking uncontrollably. As the line connected, a new sound tore through the silence of the house. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping on the glass of the back door. Tap, tap, tap. It was playful, mocking, and deliberate. He knew she was there. He knew she was armed, and he simply did not care. The operator's voice crackled in her ear, asking for her emergency. Sarah whispered her address, her voice barely a squeak, tears streaming down her face. He is outside, she whimpered into the receiver. He is watching me. He is trying to get in. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then a horrific crash shattered the night. The living room window, just down the hall from the kitchen, had been smashed in. The sound of tinkling glass raining onto the hardwood floor was followed by the heavy, sickening crunch of a boot stepping inside her sanctuary. He was in. Sarah clamped her free hand over her mouth to stifle a sob that was fighting to escape. The dispatcher was saying something, telling her to stay on the line and hide. But Sarah couldn't hear over the roaring of blood in her ears. She heard the intruder moving. He wasn't rushing. He was taking his time. The footsteps were heavy, wet, and deliberate, moving from the living room carpet onto the wooden floor of the hallway. He was whistling a low, discordant tune, something that sounded like a nursery rhyme twisted into a nightmare. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the layout of her home. The pantry was too far. The basement door was exposed. She was trapped under the table, visible to anyone who walked into the kitchen. The whistling grew louder, vibrating against the floorboards. He was at the kitchen threshold. Sarah opened her eyes and saw the tips of his muddy boots stop at the entryway. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then she heard the distinct sound of him inhaling deeply, smelling the fear in the air. Just as the boots shifted and he took a step toward the table, blue and red lights flashed against the kitchen walls, cutting through the darkness like strobe lights. Sirens wailed, close and deafening. The intruder cursed, a guttural sound of pure rage that sounded less like a man and more like a cornered animal. He turned and sprinted back toward the broken window. Sarah didn't move until the police kicked down the front door and called out her name. When they searched the house, they found the mechanic's jumpsuit discarded in the backyard, along with a rusted butcher knife that did not belong to Sarah's kitchen set. But the most chilling detail wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't find. The phone used to send the text message was never recovered, and the man in the mask was never caught. To this day, Sarah refuses to be alone on Halloween night. But the suburbs are not the only place where Halloween horrors hide. Sometimes the danger lies in the places we go to be scared on purpose, where the boundaries of reality are intentionally blurred. Our second story takes us to the vast, isolated cornfields of rural Nebraska in October of 2016. Mark worked as a scare actor at a local attraction called The Devil's Harvest. Was a massive corn maze that wound through 20 acres of tall, drying stalks. His job was simple: wear a burlap sack mask, hide in the shadows of Sector 4, and jump out at teenagers with a chainsaw that had the chain removed. It was grueling work, cold and repetitive, but Mark enjoyed the adrenaline and the easy money. On this particular night, it was near closing time. The air was frigid, hovering around 40 degrees, and the mist was starting to settle over the crops. The last group of customers had supposedly passed through an hour ago. The manager's voice came over the walkie-talkie clipped to Mark's belt, crackling with static. All stations clear. Head back to the barn. Mark sighed, relieved that the night was over. He turned off his chainsaw, the sudden silence of the field pressing in on him immediately. He began the long walk back through the maze, using his phone flashlight to navigate the twisting, muddy paths. He had walked about 5 minutes when he heard it, rustling in the corn to his left. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct sound of dry stalks being pushed aside by something heavy. Mark paused, shining his light into the dense wall of yellow and brown vegetation. "Hey, Jerry, is that you?" He called out, thinking it was a fellow actor trying to scare him. No answer, just the rustling, moving parallel to him. Mark shrugged it off, assuming it was a deer, and kept walking. But the sound continued, matching his pace perfectly. He stopped again. The sound stopped. He took a step. The sound took a step. A cold sweat broke out under his burlap mask, which he hadn't yet taken off. He wasn't alone in the maze. He raised his flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the rows. This time, the light caught something. 10 rows deep into the corn, standing perfectly still, was a figure. But it wasn't wearing a costume from the attraction. It was wearing a pristine, black funeral suit. And it was smiling at him. Mark stood frozen in the mud, the cold mist swirling around his legs, staring at the anomaly before him. The man in the black suit was jarringly out of place, an ink blot on a canvas of yellow and brown. He looked like he had stepped out of a funeral parlor, his suit immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and his shoes polished to a high shine that reflected the weak beam of Mark's flashlight. But it was the face that anchored Mark's feet to the earth. The skin was pale, almost translucent, pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. And the smile was fixed, a rigid rictus that did not waver. It wasn't the smile of someone enjoying a haunted house. It was the predatory baring of teeth. Mark lowered the chainsaw, the prop suddenly feeling absurdly heavy and useless in his grip. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was the owner of the land? Maybe a corporate investor checking the property? But at 1 a.m, in the middle of a muddy field? Without a light? "Sir, the attraction is closed," Mark called out, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the bravado of his scare actor persona. "You are trespassing. You need to head to the main exit immediately." The man did not speak. He did not blink. He simply raised his right hand slowly, pointing a long pale finger not toward the exit, but deeper into the darkest part of the maze, toward the back sector that bordered the dense woods. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature crawled up Mark's spine. He grabbed the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, his thumb jamming down on the talk button. "Base, this is Mark in Sector 4. I have a code gray. Strange individual in the maze." requesting backup. He waited for the crackle of the manager's voice, for the reassurance that security was on the way. But there was nothing. The radio didn't even emit static. It was completely dead, the power light dark, despite Mark having replaced the batteries just 2 hours ago. He was cut off. Mark looked back up, and his stomach dropped. The man was closer. He hadn't seen him move. In the 2 seconds Mark had looked down at his radio, the figure had covered at least 20 feet of distance without making a sound. The mud didn't make a sucking noise under his shoes. The corn stalks didn't rustle. He was just closer. The smile had widened, revealing too many teeth, and his head was now tilted at a severe angle, almost touching his shoulder, like a bird examining a worm. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Mark's confusion. This wasn't a prank. This was a predator. Mark took a step back, and another. "Stay back," he warned, raising the chainsaw as a shield, though he knew without the chain it was just a noisy, blunt object. The man took a step forward. It was a jerky, unnatural motion, like a stop-motion animation puppet. Snap. He was there. Snap. He was closer. Mark turned and ran. He didn't care about the mud or the corn whipping his face. He sprinted back down the path he had come from, his breath tearing at his throat. He knew this maze better than anyone. He had worked here for 3 seasons. He took a sharp left, aiming for the shortcut near the water tower prop. He ran for 2 minutes straight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the junction where the shortcut should have been, but he stopped dead. It wasn't there. The path was gone. Where there should have been a gap in the rows, there was a solid wall of corn, woven together so tightly it looked like a barricade. He spun around, disoriented. Had he taken a wrong turn? No, he was sure of it. He shone his light frantically around, the beam shaking violently. That was when he heard it. Not behind him, but from all sides. Rustling. It started soft, a whisper of dry leaves rubbing together, and grew into a cacophony. It wasn't just one person moving through the corn. It sounded like dozens. They were in the rows, moving parallel to him, encircling him. The hunter had become the herded. Mark realized with terrifying clarity that the man in the suit hadn't been chasing him. He had been steering him. He was being pushed away from the exit, guided into the center of the 20-acre trap. He backed away from the blocked path, turning to face the only open route left to him. And there, standing at the far end of the long, narrow corridor of corn, illuminated by the fading beam of his flashlight, were 3 more men. They were identical to the first. Same black suits, same pale skin, same impossible, rigid smiles. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the way, and in unison, they began to walk toward him. Mark realized in that split second that the path was a coffin. If he stayed on the cleared ground, he was playing by their rules, and their rules ended with him cornered. He didn't scream. He didn't try to negotiate. Instead, he did the one thing the men in the suits didn't seem to anticipate. Mark yanked the starter cord of his chainsaw. The engine roared to life, a jagged mechanical scream that shattered the silence of the field. Even without a chain, the aggressive, deafening noise was a weapon of intimidation. The 3 men flinched, their synchronized movements breaking for a fraction of a second. Mark didn't charge at them. He spun 90 degrees to his right and charged headfirst into the solid wall of corn. He used his shoulders as a battering ram, the dry, sharp leaves slicing at his face and hands like paper cuts from hell. He ran blindly, crashing through the stalks, listening only to the roar of the engine in his hands and the blood pounding in his ears. Behind him, the composure of the men evaporated. He heard a sound that was not human. It was a high-pitched, chittering screech, like a swarm of locusts amplified 1,000 times. It wasn't coming from one throat. It was coming from everywhere. Mark didn't look back. He pumped his legs, his boots slipping in the mud, fighting the exhaustion that tried to drag him down. The corn seemed endless, a yellow purgatory designed to trap him forever. Suddenly, his foot caught on a hidden root, and he went down hard, the chainsaw sputtering and dying as it hit the wet earth. Silence rushed back in, heavy and immediate. Mark scrambled to his knees, mud coating his eyes, waiting for the cold grip of a hand on his shoulder. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Just the distant sound of a semi-truck engaging its air brakes on the highway. Mark crawled the last 20 feet, bursting out of the cornfield and tumbling down a grassy embankment onto the shoulder of Route 81. He flagged down a passing pickup truck, his appearance wild and terrifying, covered in mud and blood. The driver, an old farmer, nearly drove off but stopped when he saw the genuine terror in Mark's eyes. When the police arrived and searched the maze an hour later, they found Mark's chainsaw where he had dropped it. But they found no footprints other than Mark's. The mud in the rows where the men had stood was smooth and undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. Mark quit his job that night and moved 2 states away, but he still sleeps with a nightlight. He knows what he saw. He knows that in the dark, desolate corners of the world, there are things that wear human shapes like ill-fitting suits, just waiting for someone to walk into their trap. The final story of our trilogy brings us into the modern, claustrophobic intimacy of a stranger's car. It is October 31st, 2018, in the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, Washington. Elias was a 26-year-old rideshare driver trying to make extra rent money on the busiest night of the year. His car smelled of stale pine air freshener and damp upholstery. He had spent the last 6 hours ferrying drunk college students in provocative costumes from one house party to another. It was boring, routine work, and by 3 in the morning, the surge pricing had ended, and the streets were beginning to empty. Elias was about to log off and head home when his phone pinged with one last ride request. The passenger's name was listed simply as guest, which wasn't uncommon, but the pickup location made Elias pause. It was located at the very end of an industrial pier in the chaotic shipyard district, a place that was usually locked down at night. Against his better judgment, Elias accepted the ride. The money was good, and it was a long fare to a residential area north of the city. As he drove toward the pier, the city lights faded behind him, replaced by the looming skeletal shapes of shipping cranes and stacked cargo containers. The rain lashed against his windshield, blurring the world into streaks of gray and black. He reached the pin drop on the map. It was a dead end, a desolate cul-de-sac surrounded by rusted chain-link fences. There was no one there. Elias put the car in park and checked his phone. "I am here," he texted. No reply. He waited for 2 minutes, the unease starting to prickle at the back of his neck. Just as he reached for the gear shift to cancel the ride and leave, the back passenger door opened. Elias jumped, his heart hammering. He hadn't heard anyone approach the car. The rain was loud, yes, but not that loud. A figure slid into the back seat, bringing with it a gust of freezing cold air and the smell of wet earth and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. Elias looked in the rearview mirror, but he couldn't see the passenger's face. The person was wearing a hooded red raincoat, slick with water, and a plastic mask. It wasn't a monster mask or a superhero mask. It was a clear, transparent plastic mask, the kind used for facials or protection, pressing down on the person's features, distorting them into a smashed, suffocated look. "Rough night?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady, forcing a customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. The passenger didn't answer. They just sat perfectly still in the center of the seat, water dripping from the red coat onto the pristine upholstery. "Heading north, right?" Elias confirmed, glancing at the app. The passenger slowly nodded, a stiff, mechanical movement. Elias pulled away from the curb, fighting the urge to tell the stranger to get out. As they merged onto the highway, the silence in the car grew heavy, suffocating, and unnatural. Elias turned on the radio to break the tension, but all he got was static. And then, from the back seat, came a sound. It was a wet, gurgling inhale, like someone trying to breathe through a fluid-filled lung. Elias gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel so tightly that the tendons in his hands felt like they were about to snap under the pressure. The interior of the sedan, usually a safe haven of climate-controlled isolation, had transformed into a suffocating chamber of horrors. The wet, gurgling sound from the back seat had ceased, but it was replaced by a silence that was somehow heavier, more pregnant with threat than the noise had been. He risked another glance at the rear-view mirror, hoping against hope to see the passenger looking out the window, distracted by the passing blur of city lights. But the passenger was not looking at the scenery. The figure had shifted to the center of the bench seat and was leaning forward, the clear plastic mask hovering just inches from the gap between the two front seats. Through the condensation that had formed on the inside of the plastic, Elias could see the eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and devoid of any human warmth, fixed intently on the back of Elias's neck. A wave of nausea rolled over him, triggered by the intensifying stench of decay that seemed to be radiating from the red raincoat. It was thick and cloying, coating the back of his throat like oil, a mixture of wet soil and sweet, rotting lilies. He cleared his throat, the sound startlingly loud in the confined space, trying to summon a courage he did not feel. "Hey, man, look," Elias said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound authoritative and calm. "I am going to have to drop you off at the next exit. My car is acting up. The engine light just came on, and I can't take you all the way north." It was a lie, and a flimsy one at that, but his survival instinct was screaming at him to get this thing out of his vehicle immediately, regardless of the consequences or the bad rating. He signaled to exit onto a well-lit service station ramp, desperate for the safety of fluorescent lights and security cameras. As his foot moved to the brake pedal, a hand shot out from the back seat. It was pale, the fingernails caked with black soil, and it clamped onto Elias's right shoulder with a grip that felt like a steel vise. The cold that radiated from the hand was shocking, penetrating through his heavy jacket and flannel shirt, freezing the skin underneath instantly. Elias gasped, the car swerving slightly across the lane markers as his muscles seized up in panic. He tried to shake the hand off, shrugging his shoulder violently, but it was immovable, an anchor of dead weight pulling him back into the nightmare. "Keep driving," the passenger whispered. The voice was dry and raspy, sounding like dead leaves being crushed underfoot, lacking any moisture or life. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with absolute, terrifying certainty. Elias felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, a mixture of frustration and pure, unadulterated terror. He straightened the wheel, pulling back onto the highway, obeying the monster in his back seat, because the alternative felt like immediate death. He looked at the GPS on his phone, mounted to the dashboard. The destination had changed. He hadn't touched the screen. The passenger hadn't touched the screen. Yet the pin had moved from the residential neighborhood to a location Elias knew well, a place that made his blood run cold. The destination was now set for the Holy Cross Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard that was pitch black and completely deserted at this hour. The estimated arrival time was 12 minutes. 12 minutes left to live. The digital map flickered, the blue line guiding him toward the darkness, like a vein carrying poison to a heart. The grip on his shoulder tightened, the fingernails digging in painfully, piercing the fabric of his coat. Elias could feel the passenger leaning closer, the plastic mask brushing against his ear. He could hear the shallow, wet breathing again, right next to his head, filling the front cabin with the smell of the grave. He was trapped in a moving cage, hurtling at 60 miles per hour toward a graveyard, with a creature that smelled of the earth and death. He thought about crashing the car into the concrete median. He thought about slamming on the brakes and tucking into a roll. But fear is a paralyzing agent, and Elias was frozen, his body on autopilot, driving his own hearse. As the exit for the cemetery approached, the passenger spoke again. "They are waiting for me," the voice rasped. Elias didn't want to know who they were. He didn't want to know why someone covered in grave dirt needed a ride to a cemetery at 3 a.m. He just wanted to see the sunrise. He took the exit, the tires crunching on the gravel of the access road, and the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wrought iron gates of the graveyard. They were wide open. We are approaching the final destination, and there is no turning back now. If you want to see how this nightmare ends, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. And tell me in the comments, what is the one gut feeling you ignored that you wish you hadn't? Elias guided the vehicle through the rusted iron gates, the tires crunching loudly over the loose gravel of the cemetery's main drive. The high beams of the sedan cut through the thick, swirling fog, illuminating the rows of weathered tombstones and weeping angel statues that seemed to turn their heads as the car passed. The atmosphere inside the car had shifted from terrifying aggression to a solemn, heavy sorrow. The grip on Elias's shoulder loosened, but the hand remained there, a cold weight resting on his collarbone, a constant reminder that he was not in control. The GPS led them deep into the heart of the burial grounds, past the modern plots, and into the older section where the mausoleums stood like miniature stone houses for the dead. The silence of the graveyard was absolute, pressing against the windows of the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the ragged breathing of the driver. Elias's hands were shaking so bad he could barely keep the car on the narrow path. He checked the time on the dashboard clock. It was 3:33 in the morning, the witching hour, the time when the veil between worlds is said to be at its thinnest. "Stop," the voice rasped from the back seat. It was a whisper that sounded like dirt sliding down a coffin lid. Elias slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly in the mud before coming to a halt next to a massive, ancient oak tree. Under the tree was a freshly dug grave, the mound of earth still dark and wet, covered by a tarp that flapped lazily in the wind. Standing around the grave were 5 figures. They were motionless, dressed in dark, formal clothing that looked decades out of date. They held no umbrellas against the rain, and their faces were obscured by the shadows of wide-brimmed hats and veils. They were waiting, just as the passenger had said. Elias felt the cold hand lift from his shoulder. The back door opened with a groan of metal that echoed through the quiet night. The cabin light flickered on, and for the first time, Elias got a clear look at the passenger in the rearview mirror as they exited. The red raincoat was tattered and torn at the back, revealing glimpses of pale, waterlogged skin and deep, jagged wounds that no living person could sustain. The passenger stepped out into the rain, the plastic mask still obscuring their face, and walked slowly toward the group of silent figures. Elias didn't wait to see the reunion. He didn't wait for a fare. He shifted the car into drive and slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction on the gravel. He sped toward the exit, risking a crash at every turn, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't look back until he was 3 miles away, under the harsh, comforting glow of a 24-hour diner sign. When he finally mustered the courage to look at the back seat, it was empty. But the seat was soaked through with a mixture of seawater and black silt. And sitting in the middle of the puddle was a single object, a silver coin minted in 1922, cold as ice. Elias reported the incident to the police the next morning, leaving out the supernatural details. The report stated that a grave had been disturbed in the Holy Cross Cemetery that night. It was the grave of a man who had drowned in a shipyard accident in 1922, whose body had reportedly been lost at sea until a recent dredging operation recovered remains. The family had held a midnight burial ceremony, but there was no record of any attendees. Elias never drove for a ride-share app again. He sold his car the next day and took a job in a warehouse, where the lights are always on and there are no strangers sitting behind him in the dark. These three stories: Sarah in her suburban fortress, Mark in the cornfield maze, and Elias on the rain-slicked road, serve as a chilling reminder. We build walls, we lock doors, and we tell ourselves that the monsters are just stories we tell to scare children. But on Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves fall, the world remembers that fear is primal. The mask does not always hide a friend. Sometimes it hides a hunger. The knock at the door might not be a trick-or-treater, and the passenger in your car might be going to a destination you can never return from. So this Halloween, when you hear a noise in the basement or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, don't brush it off. Listen to your instincts. Because the only thing scarier than a ghost story is realizing that you are currently living in one. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are waiting for you to open the door.